Hi, and a very warm welcome from me, Dr. Phil Parker, to this Life Skills and Coaching in NLP. This is an online seminar, and we're really pleased to be able to deliver this to you in this particularly interesting way at this strange time. I'm recording this during the coronavirus crisis and the lockdown. And one of the reasons we moved towards doing an online version of this course was particularly because people can't travel naturally when the coronavirus is going on. But also over the years, people have said, we'd love to do this course. We've heard so many good things about it, but I live in America or Russia and I can't get to it. So it's great to have this opportunity to deliver it to you in this brand new format. There's a few things that might be useful for you to learn and know about how we'll be delivering the course. The first thing is you can do it at your own pace. So it gives you the opportunity to choose the time scale that you watch it in. If you need to stop, have a cup of tea, gin and tonic, whatever it is that you need to get through, then you can do it. Of course, you have the ability to rewind the videos so that you can look at them at any time and go back over things. That would be really useful for some of the stuff I'll be talking about. And also, it just means that you can do it kind of in your own pace, your own speed, in chunks that feel right for you. So really welcome to this course. We've been delivering this course for years. It's been one of our most successful and loved courses. People get so much from it. And I've designed it and tweaked it so it's going to work for you just as well as if you come to see me face to face. We can use technology in really interesting ways to make sure it's engaging and keeps you hopefully on the edge of your seat for the next roughly 10 hours. So let's begin. So let's have a little bit of an overview of what we're going to cover. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at looking at the world through NLP eyes. And I'll be describing exactly what NLP is, neuro-linguistic programming, in great detail in a little bit. Looking at the world through NLP eyes gives us an opportunity to really see the world in a different way. And one of the nicest ways I've always thought of the people who describe this course is they say it's like learning the things that we never learnt at school that would have been so useful for us. I mean, I don't know about you, but I spent a long time learning trigonometry, learning some Latin, all sorts of stuff. It was kind of interesting, but I've never used it since in all my years. And they never taught me the things I really needed to learn, like how to deal with difficult bosses, how to deal with relationships, how to deal with situations where you're getting annoyed and it's not appropriate. All that kind of stuff we never got taught how to do. And the course really fills in some of those gaps. People find that having done the course, they come out of it and you're like, wow, this just makes life so much simpler, so much easier. So what are we going to be covering? We're going to be looking at how the brain makes change. Now, how the brain makes change is a really interesting thing to look at. We're gonna show some videos about that, teach you some of the anatomy and physiology, but fundamentally, I'd like you to just pause for a minute and think about change. What do people think about change? Ask yourself that question. What do people think about change? They think it's fast, think it's slow, easy, hard. Just have a think about that. So I asked you, what do people think about change? And there's such a range of experiences of change that people have. But fundamentally they say, don't they, that there are a few things that are certain in life. One is death and taxes, but probably the third is change. Stuff changes all the time. There's constantly changes in government, there's fluctuations in the stock markets, there's changes in births and deaths and marriages and so forth. So change is a constant, and yet people often have a very difficult relationship with change. So people may say, this isn't changing fast enough, or this is changing too fast, or this isn't changing at all, I really want it to change, or it's changing and I don't want it to change, or it's changing and I did want it to change, but not in this way. So change can be forced from the outside that you don't want, and many of you may have been in those companies where they have a kind of change program and people often don't like it. They don't like things being different. even though it might be slightly better. Sometimes when change happens, no real change happens. Things just get rearranged, but it's fundamentally the same. So people have very interesting relationships to change. Some people think change occurs very quickly. Other people think change occurs very slowly. Mostly people think that change sometimes happens quickly and sometimes happens slowly. But that doesn't really make any sense, because if change can happen quickly, then it can happen quickly. So what needs to occur for change to occur? Because a lot of people have tried a lot of things to try and shift things to make that change, and have just failed time and time again. You maybe know people who, keep on every year, New Year's, they make the same New Year's resolutions, which they make again the next year because they never deliver on it, or they're constantly trying to lose that weight or stop that habit. It's very, very common that people get stuck trying to change things. You may also find people quitting one relationship and ending up kind of going out with somebody who's almost exactly the same as the last person with the same issues, or going to a job and complaining their boss is no good again and again and again. So a lot of people get stuck in habits and don't change, but really want to, or as I say, sometimes change is forced upon them. Here's a quick exercise for you to do about how the brain works. The brain is constantly doing stuff. We're going to talk about this again and again with the P of NLP programming. What I'd like you to do is just lift your right foot very slightly in the air and then turn your foot clockwise. So rotate it clockwise, just off the ground. Just keep that going. And then whilst you do, with the hand you write with, your right hand, just draw a 6 in the air with the hand that you write with. Notice what happens to your foot when you do that. Now what you'll notice is that your foot suddenly switches direction without you kind of asking it to do it. Our brain constantly does stuff like this. Here's another one. Sign your name in the air. Just sign your name. It should be something you're very familiar with. And then what I'd like you to do is find out if you can do it with your nose. Just sign your signature with your nose, and you'll find you can do it very easily. You can do it with your right knee. You can do it with your toe. You can do it with any part of your body, even though you've never practiced it, because the brain is very busy making interesting connections all the time. So understanding how the brain makes change would be really, really useful if you want to understand why you're stuck, or if you want to help people make change. Now, a quick thing about this course. One of the reasons for the existence of this course is it basically fulfills 3 roles. First of all, there are people who are like, I'm just really interested in NLP coaching, how life is. I'm just fascinated by it. I want to learn more about it. Great reason to be on this course. Second reason is people who are like, I'm stuck with some stuff. There's things I like to change. I'd like some extra skills. Maybe I've done some other training like the lightning process. I want to support that thing I've learned and develop even more. Another great reason for being on the course. And the third reason for being on the course is some people kind of go, you know what, I would love to apply some of these skills. People have often said to me, you're a really good listener, or when you talk to me, it really helps me, and people seek you out to support. There's probably quite a few people listening to this who find that people seek you out for help and support and advice. So these are people who go, I'd like to take this further. I'd like to become a professional, a clinician, a coach, a practitioner, maybe even a lightning process practitioner, hypnotherapist, and so on. Well, this course is the first building block, like a Lego block, that we build on it from this course. So if you're just doing it for your own personal development, it is a standalone course. You don't need to do any more training with us. Just this is a 2-day course, but the 10 hours of it will be enough. You'll get everything you need. But if you want to take it further and become a clinician, then this becomes the first building block of that, and there are other modules that follow on from it. So some people will have a very different reason for being on this course, and it doesn't really matter what your reason is. You all get the benefit of the course depending on what filter, what lens you're seeing this through. So if you're someone who does want to help people to make change, then understanding about how change occurs or doesn't occur, how stuckness occurs, will be really, really useful as a building block in that journey. Another really important thing I'm going to teach you is the power of states. And we'll come on to that later on, but it's absolutely essential. One of the most important things you can probably ever learn in your life. We're going to cover that in the next hour. We're also going to look at how you build great relationships. And by that, we don't just mean intimate, interpersonal relationships, husband, wives, boyfriends, girlfriends type thing. We also mean just any relationship with your boss, with your customers, with your clients, with people you bump into. How can you build great relationships? Because there's loads of evidence that the quality of our relationships has a direct effect on our happiness, our longevity, our health, all sorts of stuff. So how do we build great relationships? And particularly when, you may have noticed, a lot of people are difficult to be around. It's not us, obviously, it's the other people. But we bump into people, we come across people who are just tricky to hang around, or that's at least the way it seems to us. Other people sometimes don't feel the same way about it. So how do we build great relationships? It's relatively easy to build great relationships with people who are easy to be with. But how do we build great relationships with people who are a bit more tricky? And yet those are the people we will bump into, both, in professional and personal relationships sometimes. How do we make that work? And I'm also going to teach you something really important, which is one of the key ways to destroy relationships, particularly in interpersonal close relationships, and how to avoid it. So watch out for that. And that's called the why question. So we'll come up to that later on. So there's the general kind of overview of the things that we'll be doing. So if you're ready for the ride, get yourself into a relatively quiet space where you're not going to be disturbed. I'd recommend having a pen and paper. If you have a camera as well, like a little iPhone with a camera, that would be useful for some of the exercises as well. Get yourself comfy and we'll move on to the next segment. Next up, I'm going to show you a video of a guy from NASA. And the first guy you're going to see is actually a PR guy. He's talking about an astronaut who's about to show up on camera. And what you'll see as you watch this video is a very interesting phenomenon around change. I'm going to show the video and then I'll describe what's going on.
So after the astronauts get back from the space station, it usually takes them a while to get adjusted to life on Earth.
Launch on the Soyuz is amazing, quite a bit different from the shuttle. The Soyuz is a bit more like...
With the whole gravity thing?
Sorry. The Soyuz actually is a bit shaped like this pen. It goes up straight up through the atmosphere. Now, you've got the space station right up there. It's doing gravity.
So what we can see is the astronaut has been in the space station for just a few months, but it's been enough of an experience for him to completely forget, to completely change his version of the world as regards gravity, because obviously in the space station there isn't any gravity. So if you put something in the air, it will stay there. It may move very slightly, but it doesn't drop. And there's a really interesting thing. You may want to rewatch the video. You'll see when he first drops his coffee cup, he doesn't even notice the sound as it falls. And when he realizes it's not there anymore, he goes to grab it. Where does he look? Have a look at the video. You'll see he doesn't look down. He kind of looks all over. And the same, just a few seconds later, he does exactly the same thing with a pen. When he lets go of the pen, he goes back to find it, and he looks up. He imagines it must have gone up, and then eventually he kind of looks down. And then he realizes that gravity has had an effect. Now, that's quite extraordinary, isn't it? You'd think something as familiar to us as gravity, which means when I take this pen, my little Soyuz spaceship, and I drop it, I know where it's going to go. I know it's going to go down. Okay, we all have that experience. That's an experience we've developed through learning and observing day in, day out. And so we know that's how gravity works. He knew that until he went to space. When he went to space and gravity changed, because there's no gravity in space, he had to adapt and learn a new version of how gravity or things respond when you let go of them. So much so, he learned that so well that when he came back to land in Earth, he's forgotten that. So that's a really good example of change. How something that is absolutely central to pretty much everyone's lives is so used to it, you don't have to think about it. We know when we drop it, where we need to catch it. Yeah, can change that quickly and that permanently. so that when he comes back to Earth, he forgets that things drop. Quite amazing. We're going to come back to this video when I talk later on about maps of the world, because this is a really good example of him having a map of the world, in this case a map, a version, a model of how gravity works, how reality works, which he's learnt in the space station, which no longer applies when he comes back to Earth, and yet he's still operating from that map. He's still seeing the world in that way. So let's move on to the next section. Over the years, we found there's certain ways that seem to really help you get the best out of the vast amount of information I'm going to be throwing at you in these lectures. The first thing I really recommend you do is that you read the notes that we've given you before you even listen and watch the videos. The reason being is, if you already are a bit familiar with the material, then when you see me talking about it, instead of having to go, oh, this is completely new, you'll be able to pay attention to it and engage with it in a slightly deeper level. Now, of course, because you can rewind, you can do this a few times, but I'd really recommend watching and reading through the notes, looking at stuff before you even watch the videos. As you listen to me, you'll hear me telling lots of stories, lots of anecdotes, lots of metaphors, and there's a very good reason for this. Metaphors, anecdotes, and stories are a great way to convey information in a way that's very memorable. So, for instance, if you write down in your notebook NASA, or dropping the pen, then you will remember the whole of that video and what it means about change and how people respond to change, how quickly change can occur. Without having to write all that down, you can just write the word NASA and that will recall it for you. And one of the things I'm going to be doing is telling lots of stories, but also using a lot of the skills that we will be teaching you. I'll be doing those skills on you as part of the delivery, and I'll be pointing them out as we start to uncover them. So you'll see, oh, that's what Phil was doing there. And this is a multi-layer level way of teaching that we often do, where we will teach you some of the things we're going to teach you, and then later on we'll say, oh, remember when I did that thing. Yeah. So I'll refer back to the NASA video later on when we get to talk about maps, as I mentioned, and that will remind you about that whole concept. So write down just the titles or anything that will key you into remembering a story or an anecdote or a tale that I tell, and they'll be really useful learning tools. The other thing, as you hear me do stuff, and we'll do some demonstrations and examples of stuff, if you hear me say something, you think, oh, it's a really interesting way of putting that, it's a very clever or smart way of saying that, then write it down. Now, you've got the benefit of having the videos. You just pause, rewind a few seconds and write it down, and use that, so that when you start to put these tools into practice in your life, you can actually just borrow some statements that I've used. With time, you'll become better at creating some of these things for yourself. And that brings me on to another point, which is, I said before, there is three kind of main reasons for doing the course. One is for personal development, one is because you want to solve some stuff, and the third reason is you want to become a clinician or a practitioner. Very important to recognize that in this 10-hour segment, this does not skill you up to be a practitioner, because of course it takes longer than that. It takes longer to be a plumber than 10 hours. So to work with people, you need longer experience and deeper skill sets. And that's why there is this longer diploma course, which is the very first part of, which some people will elect to go on to. If you are somebody who has some clinical skills already, let's say you're a doctor or a physio, and you attend this course, you'll be able to take some of these skills into your clinical practice, but you won't be a practitioner of NLP. If you are using it for personal development, that's great, but again, you will not be an NLP practitioner. If you go online, you can find people saying, oh, I'll train you in NLP in 5 hours for 10 quid. And you're just wasting your money, because you can't be trained to the level that you need to actually be a genuine practitioner, a real clinician working with real clients in that short period of time. So just to clarify that, it is one of the problems with NLP is that there isn't a kind of standard of saying people who are practitioners have this different skill set and they are clinically able to work with people. So if you want to find an NLP practitioner, the best thing to do is email me, and I will let you know who I've experience of either training or working with who I consider to be the level they need to be. As I say, it's one of the problems we're trying to resolve in NLP at the moment of how do we get standards so that if somebody comes to an NLP practitioner, they know at what level they've been trained to, whether they've just done an online 2-hour course or have done like a year-long training working with clients. So that's just an aside. You can use these skills for yourself. That's the real focus of this portion of the course, using it on yourself, working out stuff for yourself. You can maybe apply it to your family a little bit if you've got kids, although I have kids and they never listen to me, and I know all about this sort of stuff, so it does depend a little bit on your relationship with them. Generally we say, if you're a practitioner, don't work with family. It tends to be very messy. The kind of boundaries are very blurred. They've seen you dancing at Christmas and being ill and sleeping in front of the telly and all sorts of stuff. And so maybe they don't take you with the gravitas that maybe they should do. But equally, if you have a kid and they're scared about having a nightmare or can't get to sleep, then you actually could use some of these skills to help them, as you'll see as we go through the course, to shift how they feel. But as I say, it's not training at this stage to be a practitioner. That you would have to do the longer course in order to achieve that. So let's now move on to what is NLP. So NLP, first of all, I'll tell you a bit about the history later on, but it stands for Neuro-Linguistic Programming. I'm going to take each word separately. Neuro. Neuro means your neurology. Now, you probably know this, but if you have your brain in your head, which processes vast amounts of information and data about what's going on. And it has basically two major functions. It processes information that's coming into it, so what we see, what we hear, what we feel, what's going on inside our body, how fast our heart is beating, how warm our body feels, what the chemical constituents of our blood is right now, all sorts of stuff, processing all that data. So that's what's called input information, and that includes to some extent our thoughts, our internally generated thoughts. Second thing it does, and it gets that information from every single part of your body. Every tiny cell is monitored by the nervous system. Second thing that happens is it then decides what to do. So it tells our body what to do. So it may tell me to touch my nose, or to scratch my forehead, or to run fast, or to talk. So the way my mouth, tongue, jaw is working, it's all being controlled by my brain. It's telling it what to do without me thinking about it most of the time. So your nervous system processes loads of information and then makes decisions, and it causes us to act and move in certain ways. So that's what our nervous system does. That's the N of neuro. Next is the L. The L is for linguistics, which basically is language. And it's looking at language in a very particular way. It's looking at how our language affects our neurology. And you could argue there are two types of language here, which we're going to come to later on. There's our verbal language, the words we use, and then there's our non-verbal language, the movements we make with our body. And sometimes these things, as we're going to find out later on, are out of sync. If you ask a child who's stolen a biscuit they shouldn't have, so did you steal that biscuit? Sometimes you'll see this, no, where the head is going yeah, and the voice is saying no. So sometimes we'll be looking at verbal language, but we'll also be paying attention to non-verbal language, body language, very, very important, and how that affects our nervous system, and also how it affects other people's nervous system, because of course our language has an impact on other people. But probably most importantly, our language, our internal conversations have an effect on ourselves. And lastly, we have P for programming. A little bit about the history of why the word programming is there. So the L is because Professor John Grinder, was a professor of linguistics, and he was very interested in language. Richard Bandler, the other co-author of NLP, I'll talk about these guys later on, was a computer scientist. So he was very interested in programming. He was interested in the idea that the brain does work a little bit like a computer. When you get a computer out of the box, if it's got no software on it, it doesn't really do very much. We have to tell it what to do. We have to put programs in it to make it work. And of course, in these interesting times of the coronavirus, remember that if you listen to this months later, we can see how also viruses affect whole systems. And computers, of course, have viral programs that just spend their time causing trouble. So the way a computer works depends on what kind of software it's running, what kind of programs it's running. Same with our brain. What kind of programs are you running? Now, sometimes the programs we run are brilliant, as we're going to find out, and sometimes the programs we run are not so good. But quite often the programs we're running are on automatic pilot. For instance, you may have found yourself had that experience where you're driving, let's say, to work, and you're not concentrating, and you end up driving to the supermarket, and you arrive at the supermarket going, how did I get here? And when you look at it, you realize you managed the junctions fine, you didn't run over too many people, you were quite competent, even though you were completely on autopilot. And we do this a lot. We find ourselves, don't we, getting into conversations, we go, oh no, I've done it again. I've had the same conversation with this person that I knew was going to end in an argument, and I just fell into that trap or started chatting in that way, and I could almost notice myself doing it, but I felt powerless to stop. In hindsight, we kind of go, I wish I hadn't have done that. But quite often we run programs. If you know someone who's ever chosen a baby's name, some interesting things happen. Somebody goes, I've got this lovely name, and they say the name, and their partner goes, God no, we can't have that name. And they go, why not? It goes, oh, I hate that name. And it turns out they hate that name because they had a teacher with that name, or there was someone in their class with that name, or their first girlfriend was called that and they broke their heart, or whatever it is, and they are completely locked into that word makes me feel this way. So we're going to look at this because where we are running programs that are familiar and work very well but are not useful, we get into all sorts of trouble, and we keep on doing it because most of us have no idea how to stop those programs, and we're going to be looking at some of that stuff over the course of the next 10 hours. So in just a minute we're going to move into a very important and intriguing exercise, but before we do that, I'd just like you to ask yourself this question. Have you already recognized that you've begun a new phase in your life just by starting to watch these online videos? Have you already recognized that you've already begun to start a new phase in your life just by doing this? So I'm going to show you a slide now, and you can see the title of this slide as you read it. What does it say? Well, what it appears to say is, how does your brain work? But we also know it doesn't say that, and that is exactly how your brain works. Our brain is a kind of pattern recognition machine. It's really good at spotting things and trying to make sense of something. So we see the missing vowels and we just fill them in our minds, and we can read it relatively easy as saying, how does our brain work, or does your brain work? Now there's a list of questions I'd like you to ask yourself, but before you do that, I want you to get your phone and put your camera on so that it's recording your face, and just position it. Take a few moments to do this. Just position it so that it will record your face, a bit like this video I've got of me. Take a few minutes to get that ready. You don't have to record quite yet, I'll tell you when. But let's look at the exercise now. So the first thing you're going to ask yourself is, what is the color of your bedroom? Now that would be easy if you're sitting in your bedroom right now. If you're not, it might be slightly trickier. Second question is, what was your first career? And by this I mean, what did you want to do? What did you love to do when you were like 3 or 4 or 5 and somebody said, what do you want to do when you grow up? You said, I really want to be a ballet dancer or an air stewardess or an accountant or whatever it was that you said you wanted to be. And what I'd like you to do is just take a few moments to remember the first thing you can recall that you wanted to be when you were young. Third question is, what for you is a significant or momentous event or decision in your life where you really had a sense of life changing? Either something happened to you or made a choice. Just take a moment to think about this. You don't need to write this down, you're just thinking about it. Fourth question is this one. As you read it, what does this say? Take a few moments somebody would have guessed that it says postcode backwards. What you need to do now, and this is when you get to this stage particularly, you're going to be looking back at the video of yourself. But what I'd like you to do is to say your postcode backwards. Not writing it down and reading it backwards, but to say it backwards. Number 5 will be, read this. Friend, my ring, diamond, you buy. Any idea what that is? Well, that is the first line of a Beatles song backwards. It's Money Can't Buy Me Love, and it's Buy You Diamond Rings, my friend. So for this part of the exercise, what I'd like you to do is think of a song that you know and like. Think of the chorus and just say the chorus backwards. Again, don't write it down, just say it backwards. The only rules for this are you're not allowed to choose Kylie Minogue's Lucky, 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 but you can do Happy Birthday. You can do any other song you want. So the chorus backwards. And number 6 is, what made you train? What made you do this course? And the rule is stick to 5 words. Maximum of 5 words. So quickly go through the instructions again. When you do the exercise, you put your video recorder on and then go through say the colour of my bedroom is, my first career that I wanted to do when I was young was, a momentous event or decision for me is this, my postcode backwards is, and say your postcode backwards. Again, don't read it, I want you to be thinking it. Think of a song that you like. Again, don't write it down, just recall it, but recall it in reversed order, the chorus. And finally, sticking to 5 words, what made you take this online seminar? So that's your exercise. I'd like you to do it. When you've done it, it'll take you, I don't know, between a minute and 5 minutes to do. Come back to the video and I'll go through why on earth I'm asking you these bizarre questions and why they're so important. So see you then. Welcome back. You've finished that strange exercise, and people often ask me when I show them this exercise, like, why are we doing this? These kind of slightly crazy questions, do they really have any value? Well, actually, these questions are really, really important and are the kind of foundation of everything we'll be doing over these 10 hours and most of the rest of the training courses that I run. They're so important. So let's take them one at a time. The first question is, what's the colour of your bedroom? Now, to answer that question, unless you've repainted your bedroom recently or you happen to be in your bedroom at the moment, it takes a bit of time to drag that information out. So what people will tend to do is they will leave wherever they are currently, go on a little internal journey called a transderivational search, if you're interested, to find the answer to that question, usually by kind of taking themselves off to their bedroom, having a look round and going, oh yeah, that's what colour it is. A bit like if I say to you, when you go into your house and you put your keys in the door, which way do you have to turn them to open the door? The best way to remember that is by doing it, putting your keys in your imaginary door and turning it, because you probably don't know the answer. Or if I say, where are the hinges on your front door? You probably need to push the door open to work out where the hinges must be. Or if I say, go into your bedroom, where's the light switch? You'll go in and you kind of reach to one side or this side, depending which side your light switch is on. So all this information is stored in there. We don't have great easy access to it, so we have to go on a little journey. We go on the journey in our heads and recall the information. But interestingly, when we're on that journey in our heads, we're no longer here. We're no longer present. And interestingly, we are constantly going on little journeys in our head. So if somebody says to you, what have you been up to? And they say, I've been on holiday. You go, oh, where'd you go? But as soon as they say wherever their destination was, you've gone on a little journey about holidays, generally like, where am I going on holiday? Oh, I wonder where they went. And then they say, Cuba. And in your mind, you quickly go in your little journey about Cuba. Fidel Castro, cigars, palm trees, biggest island in the Caribbean, rum. Who knows what you're thinking. But each time we do that, we're no longer actually paying attention to what the person is saying, because we've gone on our own little internal journey. And this is going to become more and more important as we move through the course. Second question was, what was your first career? Again, a strange question. To answer this question, we have to go back in time to a time when we were sitting around and people were asking us this question. I can remember my teacher used to sit around the dinner table at lunchtime saying to everyone, right, what do you want to do when you grow up? And people saying fireman and policeman. And it takes me straight back to that horrible experience of school life. So as you recall that moment, it will take you back to that time. And if that time's a nice time with nice people, it will give you happy memories. If it's not such a good time, it will bring some less pleasant feelings. The other question to ask about this is how many people who had a passion in their lives for something ended up doing it. So when I was a kid, for instance, I really wanted to be a vet. And I was sent to this careers guy, and he hadn't met me before, but he had a piece of paper with my predicted grades. And he said, what do you want to be? And I said, I want to be a vet. I want to help animals. And he looked at my piece of paper and he went, no, you're not clever enough to be a vet. You should go and be a doctor instead. And I was like, oh, okay. And I was young and impressionable. So that ended my veterinary career, and I ended up going and getting a place at medical school, specifically because I was told that route is blocked to you. And this happens a lot to people, that they have a dream and then somebody, often in authority, says, no, people like you can't do that. Girls, boys can't do that. You're not clever enough. It's a very difficult job. A million reasons why you can't do it. And it takes a lot to resist that kind of information, particularly if it's from an expert or authority figure. So that can often be why people don't achieve their dream job. The other reason can be as they grow older, they go, being an air stewardess isn't all it's cracked up to be. I thought it was going to be great. Or being a fireman, that's quite dangerous. I don't really fancy that. And we can sometimes recognize that the dream that we had is just a dream and it's not what we want to do. What's also interesting is that sometimes people fix themselves to a goal. They say, I'm going to do this. And as time goes on, they realize they don't want to do it anymore, but they keep on doing it because they said they were going to do it. And it can be very useful to recognize that sometimes the goals that we set ourselves are now past their sell-by date, and we can let them go, free ourselves from those goals. Next question was a momentous event or decision. So something really significant in your life, a moment of change forced upon you, or change that you created all by yourself. And when you think about this, what's interesting is some people will have selected something really positive, like, I decided to quit my job and go traveling. Or that time at that first baby, when I had my first baby. And somebody else, and when we do this in the classroom, often sitting next to them, says, that's interesting because I thought about the time my mum died, or I thought about something quite difficult. So sometimes you can have people saying, the day I got married, and somebody else goes, the day I got divorced. It depends on what people are experiencing. But what's interesting is the question is very interesting. First of all, everybody will have an answer to that. Everybody has something that is significant or momentous. And to ask a question that everybody has an answer to is quite a powerful thing. The second thing is, again, if what you're going back to is a really powerful, important moment in your life, like you decided to quit your job and go traveling, then remembering that moment will produce interesting feelings in your body. It will switch on neurotransmitters in your brain. It will change your hormones. It will change all sorts of things in your body just by recalling it. So remembering a really powerful experience will generate some of that neurology, some of that changed physiology. Equally, if you remember something that's not so good, that can have an effect too that changes your physiology, but in a negative way. So this raises some interesting questions. It's like, well, first of all, most of us have, I would say probably all of us, have some brilliant memories, really amazing moments in our lives. But how often do we reconnect with them? How often do we spend some time engaging with them? And how often do we spend time thinking about not so good times, difficult times? Or, I've got to take the cat to the vet, and I must pay my tax return. How much time do we spend doing that? Focusing up and engaging with either less positive memories or less positive or dull anticipations of the future. Because these will have an effect on our neurology and our physiology, as we'll cover later on when we get to that bit. Next question, postcode backwards. Now, some people will find this easy and some people will find this tricky. If you found this tricky, then your video will make very interesting viewing. And this is an opportunity to maybe pause my video and to watch your little video. And what I'd like you to do as you watch is to look at where your eyes go. Where your eyes go when you do your postcode backwards. In fact, when you do all these questions, and if you look at me doing it, you'll see this as well when you review the video, is when you take yourself back to the bedroom, your eyes will zip around. Or if we say a momentous event, you'll see people doing this. You probably often notice people doing this when they kind of look off to one side. That's a sign of internal processing and usually activating certain memories. So when you watch yourself doing your postcode backwards, the chances are, particularly if you found this difficult, you'll see this kind of thing. Sometimes you'll see gestures, people going like this. And you'll also see sometimes all sorts of wiggly movements as people try and get the numbers and letters out, like na, 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 na. And it's a bit like, when kids are learning to write, when they're first doing their letters and they're really concentrating. You may remember this when you're at school. Some kids will be like this. They stick their tongue out as they try and get all this neurological control into this tiny little part of the paper. This is what happens when we're learning a new skill, because this is what the postcode backwards is. Postcode backwards is we have a bit of neurology that allows us to produce our postcode. Now the camera may have flipped, so this may look like I'm drawing it the wrong way around, okay? But we have like a sequence, like la 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 la, la 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 la, with a little pause in the break between the segments. And so sometimes you'll see people going backwards, going and you'll see all this kind of movement, like really hard work. What I recommend you do, particularly if you found this challenging, is I'd like you to spend a few more minutes doing the same exercise again with a video camera, okay, and just do it 5 or 6 times. So if your postcode backwards is POSTCODE, okay, or whatever it particularly is, then you're going to practice it. So initially it will be POST, and with practice you'll see and hear it becoming POSTCODE. And it will start to be rhythmical. A lot of this ancillary movement, this weird movement of your head and this kind of stuff will disappear. And the eyes will also become much calmer as you watch yourself. So I'm just going to pause the video, practice that just 4 or 5 times until it starts to be rhythmical. Re-look at the video and compare it to the first one. And the first one will look like this. The second one will seem much more like it's just normal. Okay, come back in a minute while we carry on the video. The same occurs with singing a song backwards or saying a song backwards in your head. For most people that's really challenging because the song only exists in one direction. As soon as you try and pull it back the other way, it's very tough for people. And finally, what made you train? Sticking to 5 words. Now, interestingly, when you give people a rule like 5, stick to 5 words, some people will stick to 5, but many people interpret 5 as being somewhere between 3 and 7. And so you'll get some answer roughly between 3 and 7 or 8. And people will say, it was close enough. Humans are really poor at following rules. They really don't do a very good job of it. So we're in the middle of the coronavirus lockdown at the moment. Already there's been people doing all sorts of things they shouldn't be doing. Having karaoke parties and being found by the police, meeting up with groups of people outdoors. All sorts of things they're not supposed to do. The question is, who listening has ever broken the law? Well, I'm not talking about like kidnap and murder. I'm talking about tiny things like in a 30-mile-an-hour zone, maybe once you went 30 miles and a half or 31, that kind of a transgression. Or if you park on a double yellow line and you see a traffic warden running towards you with a ticket to put it on your windscreen, You go, no, wait, and you have an explanation. You're like, well, although I am parked improperly, temporarily, there's a good reason. So plus my good reason, therefore it's not really breaking the law. Yeah. So we think that if we have done something plus we've got a good reason, it doesn't really count as actually having done something wrong. And done something wrong is very interesting. This is a theme we're going to come back to again and again and again. One of the things that humans hate the most is somebody suggesting that they have done something wrong, that you're wrong in some way. We really don't like it. We will do almost anything we can to avoid it. So one human telling another human that they are wrong generally causes an interesting reaction. Do you know what the reaction is? Yep, it's they defend and become aggressive, usually. Sometimes they sulk, but mostly they will come back fighting. And what they'll normally say is, I think if you think somebody's wrong here, then it ain't me, so it must be you. And now they're telling this other person they're wrong, and that other person's a human as well, and humans don't like being told they're wrong, and they go, so you think I'm wrong? Well, let me just tell you 100 ways you're wrong. So when we suggest somebody is wrong, we actually trigger all sorts of neurology we probably don't want to. And when other people say it to us, it triggers all sorts of neurology we probably don't want to. So we're going to come back to this in just a minute. But remember, humans hate the feeling that somebody says they're being wrong. So sticking to 5 words. Did you stick to 5 words? Humans generally don't stick to 5 words. They don't stick to guidelines. They bend the rules a lot of the time. And that's useful to know if you ever hang around humans like most of us do. In a minute, we're going to move towards a really, really important concept called the concept of states. But just pause for a minute and ask yourself, what have I learnt so far? What have I learnt so far that's really intriguing and is already going to start to make a difference? What have I learnt so far that's intriguing and is already going to start to make a difference? I'll be back in a minute. So the most important thing I think anybody can learn is the concept of states. So state means you being in a particular state of mind at the moment, particular mood, particular set of thoughts, particular set of emotions, particular focus. This is all encompassed within the word state. So the important thing to know about states is humans are always in one state of mind or another, one state or another. So as you watch this, you could be fascinated. You could be wondering, what kind of trousers am I wearing? Because you can't see them. They're actually black trousers if you're interested. You might be thinking, I wonder where Phil is, or what am I having for dinner, or this is really fascinating, or a million things you could be thinking. Each one of those is a state, and we're always in one state of mind or another. Now have a look at this photo. Imagine you're in a traffic jam. We've all been in traffic jams, I think. But imagine in this time you're in a traffic jam and you're heading towards a flight, and you can tell the time is getting really tight. There's a good chance you're going to miss your flight. It's non-refundable. What are you going to do? Well, what happens? What state do we find ourselves in this situation? Well, for most people, we find ourselves to be stressed, frustrated, annoyed, angry, exploding. Interestingly, this shows up the biggest thing we need to know about states. When you're in a traffic jam and you're frustrated, angry, stressed, and most of us have experienced this, it's a question to ask, which is, does being stressed, angry, or whatever state you're in help in any way? And the answer is no, it doesn't help. And yet many of us have been in this experience, or being on a train. I travel on trains quite a lot. On trains are often delayed in England, and you see people going, so annoyed, as though that in some way will speed the travel of the train. It doesn't make any difference. It's obvious it doesn't make any difference. And yet people do it again and again and again. And this highlights a fundamental issue with humans. They are very often not in the most useful or appropriate state for the job they're doing. It's a really important question to ask yourself. Is the state I'm in the most useful, valuable, or appropriate for whatever I'm doing right now? And I'd really recommend you write this down in big letters. States and this question, is it the most useful, valuable, or appropriate state for the job I'm doing right now? And interestingly, the answer for most of us is no, I'm not in the right state. And interestingly, when you are not in the right state, the most appropriate, useful, or valuable state, life becomes tough, becomes harder, becomes more difficult. Equally, when you are in the right state, so the most appropriate state, then life becomes a lot easier. Let's look at the example of traffic. What would be a great state to be in a traffic jam? Well, how many people spend some time saying, I never get enough time to just pause the world and, gaze at the flowers and the bees and the birds and notice how great it is to be alive? Well, being in a traffic jam would be exactly the best time to do that, to get into that state, because there's not much else you can do. Because if you're in the state of stressed, anxious, what's likely to happen? What's likely to happen is you're going to crash the car, you're going to take what you think is a shortcut that ends up being a long way to the back of the queue. You're going to shout at your partner, a great way to start a holiday. You're more likely to crash. All sorts of things can go wrong when you're in that state. So being in that state is not useful. What would be a better state to choose? Well, if you could access the state of being calm and present and appreciative, that might be a more useful state to be in. Because, as I said, there's not much else you can do. You might as well use that time valuably. But how many people do that? Hardly anybody. And this brings up the second problem with humans. We are very often in the wrong state. And often we don't recognize it until afterwards. At that moment, it just feels like, of course I'm in this state. Of course I'm frustrated. I'm in a queue. I'm in a jam. The train's not running. And this shows up the third problem with humans and states, which is the majority of humans have no idea, if they do happen to recognize they're in the wrong state, which they usually don't, they have no idea how to shift from one state to a better state. They just don't know how to do it. They were never taught this at school. Were you taught this at school? I wasn't. And yet, that could be the single most important thing you ever learn to do. Because when you think about it, any time life wasn't going that well, chances are you were in not a great state to deal with it. So if you come across difficulty in your life, if you're in a difficult, not very good, resourceful, unresilient state, life becomes tough. If you are in a resilient state, in a resourceful state, the life becomes easier. There's an interesting thing that links into one of those questions I asked about momentous events or decisions. Some people will choose a negative event, like when somebody died or a relationship ended. But although it's a negative event, they'll talk about it in an interesting way, which is called post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth is where something difficult has happened, something challenging has happened. But people report, instead of saying, "Oh, that was awful," they say, "That was really tough. But," and it seems strange to say this, they will say, "I'm kind of slightly glad it kind of happened, because if that hadn't happened, I never would have opened up this avenue in my life. I wish it hadn't happened that way, but it's kind of unlikely I ever would have discovered these new things if this difficult moment hadn't occurred in my life. So in some ways I'm kind of thankful for it. I would have liked to have learned this lesson in a different way, but that's how it worked out. And so, I look back at it as a starting point for something. And what they've done is they've changed that event from being a tragic event or difficult event to being something they feel they've grown from. So that's post-traumatic growth. Other people don't have that response. They're like, oh God, this thing's happened, I'll never recover from it. They get stuck. They often end up in depression as a result of that. So there's a different relationship to events because it depends on which state you're approaching it in. Some interesting studies recently about, so people asked me years ago, they said, so Phil, one of the things I don't understand, if adrenaline is not good for us, and lots of adrenaline isn't that good for us, it suppresses the immune system and all sorts of stuff. Said, how come I love going on roller coasters? Is that bad for me? Should I avoid that because that must produce adrenaline, and we know that too much adrenaline causes trouble in your immune system? I was like, that's a good question. I don't really know the answer, because if you like going on roller coasters, yeah, you will produce adrenaline, but you wouldn't be ill at the end of the day. You'd feel exhilarated. So something's very confusing. And recently they've come up with a theory to explain this, which is they say events occur and we will either process them as a threat, which means it's difficult and we don't quite feel we have the resources to deal with them. That stresses us. Or a challenge. A challenge is where it's tricky, but we feel we have the resources to find a way through it. So it's the same event, but depending on how we feel about it, we either see it as a threat or a challenge. Now, interestingly, in a threat, our body responds physically differently from if it's a challenge. If it's a challenge, we change the levels of adrenaline and cortisol in our body, our heart rate increases, but our blood pressure pretty much either stays the same or goes slightly lower. If it's a threat, again, we produce hormones and our heart rate goes up, but our blood pressure also goes up. So there's a physiological difference. And the only difference is how we are perceiving that event, what state we are bringing ourselves into, and that changes our physiology. So people, what do we learn? People are in states all the time. The state they're in is often not the best or most useful or appropriate state for them. They have no idea that's occurring until afterwards usually, and they don't know how to change to a different state. If they could, life would be a lot easier. I was on a plane coming back from about a 10-hour journey. We hadn't even taken off yet, and there was the row behind me. There was a man and his child, and the child, as children sometimes do, was kind of knocking his head against the back of the seat. Right? The bloke behind this child, the man behind the child, stood up, tapped the father of the rocking child on the shoulder, and said to him, "Stop your child doing that. Don't you know how to raise children properly?" Now, this is a good example of making someone wrong. Remember I said about that earlier? Now, what does the father do? Well, he doesn't like being called wrong as a parent, so he stands up, faces this guy and says, "Do you want to say that again?" And the bloke says it again. He says, "Do you want to have a fight about this then?" Now, this is just the beginning of a 10-hour flight, right? They are going to be in close proximity for the next 10 hours. Are they in the best state for that journey? No, they're in awful states. The guy who's annoyed is expressing his annoyance in a way that's going to cause conflict. The other guy is taking on that conflict and wants to turn it physical. It's an awful situation, and the air stewardess see this coming, rush down the aisle and separate these guys and manage to put them in different parts of the plane. Because otherwise they're going to be in conflict in a state that's just going to churn the whole way for the next 10 hours. So humans really spend a lot of the time in the wrong state, and when in the wrong state, it causes them lots of problems. It's even more noticeable as on this aeroplane where two people are both in the wrong state. I'm going to come to that in the next slide, which is all about the question you should never ask in relationships. So if you ever find yourself asking this question in a relationship, there could be trouble ahead. The way it works is this. There's nothing wrong with asking the question why, but usually the question is not really asked as a question, in that you're not interested in the answer. It sounds something like this. Why haven't you taken out the garbage again? Now, sounds like a question. It's not really a question. We're not interested in why they haven't done it. What we're really trying to do to them is say, listen, just want to point out that I've noticed you haven't done this thing and you are wrong as a result of it. Now, remember, rewinding a few minutes, what do humans hate? They hate being any suggestion that they might be wrong. And so if you ask this kind of question, what tends to happen? If you say, why haven't you taken out the garbage again? You don't tend to get somebody going, oh, thanks for pointing that out. That's really helpful feedback. I should go and do that immediately. How very thoughtful of you. What they normally do is, because they feel instead they're being attacked and they're being told they're wrong, they come out fighting and they say, why haven't you? And then they bring the list out of things you haven't done. And again, normally you don't respond in a particularly rational way. You go, well, why haven't you done this? Because I've had all this work to do, that's why I haven't done it. Why haven't you done that? And suddenly we notice two people being in not very good states trying to have a conversation. And it's like two drunk people trying to have a conversation. They're completely not in the right state to have this conversation. And it just spirals into conflict, sulking, angry words, threats of leaving, all that kind of stuff. If you notice yourself, and some of you will, because we're all human, doing the why question, running the why question, and specifically it's when you don't really need the answer, you're not that interested in the answer, you just want to tell them you're wrong, then you want to catch yourself and stop saying it, because it won't produce anything but conflict. Just try that out. Notice what happens when you stop saying it. You don't want to kind of just sulk about it either, because there's a solution for the why question. Instead of asking the why question, there's a much more useful and important question we should ask. It's a story I often tell about a guy who's got a car, and the car is broken down by the side of the road. It happens to be a Volkswagen, and the man comes to fix it. The AA man comes to fix it, and he says, "What's wrong?" And the AA man says, "Well, it's the starter motor." And guy with the car says, what's happened? He says, well, it's failed. It's stopped working. The guy goes, why is it failed? That is the why question. The guy goes, well, I'm sure I can find out for you. And he gets the serial number off the part and he rings up Volkswagen. And he says, so I've got this starter motor and it's not working. I wonder if you could tell me anything about its history, about why it's not working. So the person in Volkswagen types that up, gets the serial number, goes, on that particular day, there was actually a bit of a problem on the factory in the production line in the starter motor department. So she tells the AA man this. He tells it back to the guy who's standing at the side of the road. He goes, what was the problem? So back to the German factory, and they go, well, the problem, apparently there was a fight between two of the co-workers on the production line. So the AA man hears that, tells it back to you standing at the roadside. It's a fight. Why was there a fight? I don't know. I'll ask them. Why was there a fight? Well, looking at the records, it looked like one of the guys had started sleeping with the wife of his colleague, and they found out on this day, and there was a big, punch up. So pass that back on. Oh, that's very interesting. So why were they fighting? He was sleeping. Oh, why was he sleeping with his wife, the other guy's wife? I'll find out. Why was he sleeping with the other guy's wife? Well, the guy who was married hadn't taken very good care of himself. He had eaten too many sausages, started to get fat, and he was balding. Fat and balding. Why was he balding? Why is he balding? Well, I just Googled it. It turns out that the balding factors are genetic through the maternal line. Fascinating stuff. So we could go on and on. We could find out why There was a problem at the factory. Why the starter motor failed. But the problem is the car is still at the roadside. It's very interesting, but we haven't resolved it because there's a question we really need to ask instead of the why question, which obviously is how. How do we fix this? And there's a big difference between these two questions. Now, why is not always wrong. There are times when you need to understand why something is the way it is. But we've got to be careful about how we use it, because why generally tends to look at the past, and in interpersonal stuff looks at who's at fault and who's to blame, and therefore who we can say, you've got this wrong. The how question instead looks at the future, looks at solutions. It's not like interested in why this is this way. It's like, okay, it is this way. How can we find a solution through it? So it's not interested in blame. It's just interested in finding a way through the issue that we find ourselves in. So coming back to our interpersonal why question, why don't you take the trash out? If we change it to, look, this seems to happen quite a lot. I get a bit annoyed. I tell you, I complain about it. You get upset that I'm complaining about it. It's not really working. How can we deal with this differently? You and me. How can we? Notice the we word rather than you. The we is a word that says us together. You is like it's your fault. How can we find a solution? Now, that will produce a much different response, because we're starting to look at how do we move this forwards rather than who caused this problem. And you're more likely to get a positive response, more likely to get a different kind of communication. So remember, catch yourself on the why question, that bad use of the why question, inappropriate and unuseful use of the why question. Replace it with a how. But what I'd like you to do is just to pause for a minute and pause the video and write down, what have I learnt from this segment? Because we're coming to the end of the very first segment. What have I learnt from this segment so far that's life-changing and particularly fascinating for me? What have you learnt? Write it down. I'll come back in just a second. Okay, so we've done the first hour. I hope it's been fascinating for you. What is the most interesting, life-changing, fascinating thing you've learned? Well, there's a lot of stuff to choose from. First of all, we looked at why are we doing this course and how are we going to do it and what's the best way to be around it and what it can teach you and what it can't teach you. Remember, you're not going to be a practitioner after 10 hours of online training. Even though it's going to be fabulous, you're not going to be a practitioner. We talked about starting to look at the world through NLP eyes, things we never learnt at school, how the brain makes change, starting to discover the power states, about building relationships, not asking the why question. Maybe remember we showed you a video of the NASA astronaut, and that was all about change, how change can occur very easily and very stably. We also looked at defining NLP. What is NLP? What does that look like? How do we describe that in a way that makes sense? N, neuro, the way our brain works, our neurology works. L, language, how our language impacts our neurology and other people's. And P, programming, how quite often we're in little habits, little rat runs that may or may not be useful for us. We then took you through a how does your brain work exercise, and we recognized that we spend a lot of our time not being present on little journeys inside our head, some of which are great, but a lot of which aren't. And then we moved into the importance of the power of states, asking this really important question: what state are you in? Is it useful? Is it valuable? Is it helpful in this situation? Is it appropriate? So like if you're, sitting with the kids watching TV, are you really there? If you're eating a meal, are you really eating your meal? Or are you thinking about what's happening next? So many people are just not here, not present. We looked at this whole idea about people not being very good at managing their states, not recognizing the wrong in the wrong, unuseful state, and how they don't find it very easy to move into a different state. They just don't know how to because they never got taught it. We talked about lots of ways that people can stitch themselves up, the why question, getting themselves into the wrong state in relationships. And if we could change that, what would that be like? And I asked you this question, do you spend enough time accessing, reconnecting with the great states, the great moments in your life? And the answer, for most people is no, I don't. I spend too much time thinking about things that aren't that good for me. So start to make a list of not only things you've learned, but what are you going to do about it? How are you going to, remember this is a life skills course, how are you going to take this into your life to make a difference? I'll see you on the next segment.